Welcome to the Avro Heritage Museum podcast, supported by Museum Development North and Arts Council England.
Hello, and thank you for joining us on the podcast. Today, we'll be talking in the first of two episodes about a lesser-known Avro aircraft from the Second World War, the Manchester. It's one that is too easily, and wrongly, as it turns out, characterised as one of Chief Designer Roy Chadwick's less successful projects. In reality, it was a very sound aircraft, fundamentally let down by its engines rather than by anything inherently wrong with the design. And in this podcast, we will be hearing the story of those Rolls Royce Vulture engines, which were starved of development time and resources, which were all diverted to the Merlin. But make no mistake about it, the Manchester was the aircraft that paved the way directly to the legend that was the Lancaster. Avro's production model was crucial in this. Because of the modular design, the Manchester airframe was readily convertible to a Lancaster once the larger wings and the four Merlin engines had been fitted. If you visit the cockpit of our replica of Lancaster S for Sugar in the museum, you will see that the paint scheme inside is green. This shows that the original aircraft was one of a batch of 200 Manchesters ordered by the Air Ministry. The first 43 actually came off the assembly line as Manchesters, but then numbers 44 onwards became Lancasters. I talked to Avro member and Manchester enthusiast Jim Clancy in our studio at the museum, and I began by asking him to tell us a bit more about the Manchester's birth, its operational difficulties, and about some of the experimentation that went on around this aircraft.
In the mid-1930s, Britain was anticipating a European war, and the Air Ministry in particular wanted to upgrade their existing bomber fleet because it was primarily out of date. New technology was coming along, and they realised that the aircraft they had weren't going to hack it if a major war with Germany did come about. So they issued what became known as Specification P1336, which was calling for a twin-engine bomber capable of carrying heavy bomb loads or torpedoes over long distances. Initially, they had this thing in there as well of being able to perform a dive bombing function. Avro's design team, led by Roy Chadwick, responded to that, and first and second places in the competition were awarded to Avro and Handley Page. So these became, respectively, the Manchester on the Avro side and the Halifax on the Handley Page side. And also, it also produced the short Stirling as well, that specification, ultimately. So in terms of the Manchester, there were three issues with getting the aircraft into production. Firstly, the need to design and build the tools that the aircraft would ultimately be built on. Secondly, there were multiple design changes over the development period, which I won't go into detail, but as an example, the torpedo requirement was dropped, the dive bombing requirement was dropped, but there were all kinds of technical issues. So, for example, at one point, the Air Ministry got an idea in their heads that all the aircraft that were being produced, regardless of manufacturer, should have standard fuel tanks that would be interchangeable across aircraft, which got dropped because it was just so impractical. And the third problem was the engine choice, which was the Rolls Royce Vulture. Now, we should be careful not to cast aspersions at Rolls Royce when we talk about the Vulture, because it was very much a development engine. The Merlin that was so successful in the Second World War and that everybody recognises, and so many people still know the noise that a Merlin makes, it was so successful because it was a fully developed engine. It had gone through all the test processes and everybody understood its limitations, And they would reach the point where they were fine-tuning it. The Vulture was nowhere near that. It was very much a test engine. And that was one of the reasons that the Manchester ended up with such a poor reputation.
But to bear in mind, don't we, that the context is war.
Yes.
And there isn't time to do that full testing program. So perhaps it's not such a surprise that things don't always turn out quite as you would want them to.
Absolutely. Especially as you get into the actual production of the aircraft, which started just before war broke out, but didn't finish until after war had broken out. So the level of pressure associated with getting these aircraft available to fly operationally was huge. And in his book, Robert Kirby stresses that the efforts put in by both Avro, Handley Page, Shaw, and Rolls Royce were just phenomenal and led to a number of successful developments, not just in terms of producing aircraft, but the engines as well and the manufacturing processes. So one of the first problems they had with the Manchester over and above the engines was weight. Projected weight for the aircraft in the original design was superseded and became a huge issue. And one example of that was that when the Vultures were first delivered to the manufacturing sites, they actually weighed more than a ton per pair than the original weight that the specification, that the design had been based on. The other aspect of it as well, which was the gun turret design, which eventually, as we saw on the model in the museum, was abandoned because it was impractical. So moving on to the particular problems with the engines, there were a number of issues with it. It was two V12s stuck together, basically, one on top of the other. So the cylinders were in an X shape. And that led to issues with, I'm no engineer, but connecting rods, which couldn't stand the stress that was going on when the engine was in use. Low quality bearings. I don't really understand why Rolls-Royce decided to use them, but they were lower quality than used in other engines. There were always hydraulic issues and coolant issues, which of course, when you get hydraulic or coolant fluid all over the place, can lead to fires. And there were resource issues at Rolls-Royce due to the more important Merlin program. At this point, 1939-40, the Merlin engines are seen as a priority in terms of fighter command and the defence of Britain. So there were always issues getting not just materials, but people, the right people working on the Rolls-Royce program. The problems had been recognised fairly early on in the program, and they were severe enough to make the Air Ministry direct Handley Page to reconfigure the Halifax to take 4 Merlins on a stretched wing. In his book, Robert Kirby suggests that the Manchester ended up being the only engine testbed to fly in excess of 1,200 sorties over enemy territory. So the inaugural flight of the Manchester was in July 1939, but the testing of it was dogged by incessant engine issues of the type that I've described. And the weight and engine problems led Roy Chadwick to write to the Air Ministry with somewhat a solution presaged, but if you like, by what had happened with the Halifax, but which was to turn the Manchester into a 4-engine aircraft.
This was a critical decision, wasn't it?
Yes. And that's where the story comes from, the apocryphal story that you and I have spoken about. We don't know whether it's true or not, about the lengths that Roy Chadwick went to try and get 4 Merlins to put on his prototype Mark III Manchester. But interestingly, in that letter, he also mentioned that if the Mark III came about, they would probably change the name of the aircraft.
That would probably make sense, wouldn't it, in terms of the reputation of the aircraft, really. Calling it a Manchester Mark III.
Yeah,
probably wouldn't have been the best idea.
But bear in mind, that letter was, I think that letter was early 1940. So it's very early on. It's not operational yet. So it went into service in November 1940 with 207 Squadron. And the first operational sortie was in February 1941 when the target was Brest. Now, in total, as I said, the Manchester flew 1,264 sorties, the last of which was one of the famous 1,000 bomber raids in June 1942 when the target was Bremen. The cruiser appreciated its handling, and that's one of the things that Roger referred to. I'm talking to his father about it. And the huge bomb bay, which was capable of carrying 10,000 pounds of bombs, but they really didn't like the engines. Taking off with a full bomb load often needed every available inch of the runway. You can imagine sitting in the dark in a bomber with 10,000 pounds of bombs stacked in the bomb bay, wondering whether you're going to get over the hedge at the edge of the airfield, and climbing to operational height was often difficult to achieve. So the standard operational height that was required by the specification was around 20,000 feet, and quite often you read several accounts of pilots not being able to get above 15,000, and some quite consciously choosing to fly lower. Many aircraft were lost not to enemy action but to mechanical failure. And there was an additional problem on top of the engines, which it often sounds like an engine problem, but it wasn't. If the engine did cut out for any reason, they would feather the propeller. Propellers were made by de Havilland, but there were constant problems with that feathering mechanism, which led to handling issues over and above the fact that the engine itself had been lost.
You do hear the line that the crew would sometimes say, if the Germans don't get you, the engines will.
Yes, that's very true. And that would
illustrate, doesn't it, their concerns. Yeah.
That was because it was incredibly difficult to maintain height on one engine. It was a very physical process. If you lost one engine, the pilot would have to apply full opposite rudder, which means stamping on the rudder pedal to the fullest extent permanently until you land the aircraft. We'll come on to that story later on, which illustrate how difficult that could be.
So there actually needed brute strength.
Yeah. And that meant to many documented white knuckle rides home with the crew wondering, are we actually going to make it? Are we going to have to ditch in the North Sea? Now, the Lancaster prototype, the Mark III Manchester, as it started out life, flew in January 1941. And there's a famous quote from the test pilot who had worked on the Manchester when he got out of the aircraft after that test flight.
Just down the road at
Ringway.
Called Ringway.
Indeed.
That.
That's right, yes. And he said, we've gone from the beast to the beauty. So they knew straight away that a 4-engine version that didn't use a Vulture was a much more successful aircraft.
It would be a winner.
And the first production flight at Lancaster was in October 1941. By mid-1942, the Manchester was withdrawn from frontline service as the Lancasters came online. And out of 209 Manchesters built, nearly 40% were lost on operations and 25% in accidents. Because, of course, your engine problems were not exclusive to operational flights. And there's lots of examples of training flights where crews either vanished completely, never found, or crash landed. So that covers the operational service. And I'll go on and talk a little bit about the experimental service. Throughout the operational period, the Manchester was also involved in experimental flights and activity, predominantly at Farnborough, but one or two other places as well. And one of these, we've got a model in the museum of a Manchester sitting on top of a catapult, which was part of the original P1336 specification, but was left out of the production aircraft. But there were a few Manchesters that were deemed that were airworthy but deemed unfit for operations. And one of the things they used them for were these experiments. So the purpose of this was to give the aircraft a bit of a boost on launch. So it would have been a catapult-assisted launch method to maximise bomb load and assist in takeoff capability.
And we're in the context, presumably, of wartime, of concrete runways not always being in place yet, and also maybe damaged runways. And this would have been an alternative way of getting the aircraft off the ground.
Yeah. I'm sure one or two of the crews who flew on it would have appreciated if they'd known that was available with some of those takeoffs with a full bomb load. The other aspect that was done at the same time as that was arrested landings, which again, was part of the original spec but got dropped. And there's some wonderful stories. We'll never know if they're true or not, but there's a wonderful story. But the idea was they'd lay a cable across the runway, and at each end of the cable would be anchored with weights. The aircraft would come in. They'd have a hook hanging off the back of the fuselage, just the same as happens on aircraft carriers to this day. And the hook would catch the cable and slow the aircraft down, meaning it wouldn't need as much runway to perform. Again, as you just said about the potential damaged runways during wartime. There's a wonderful story of one experiment where the aircraft was too heavy for the weights on the end of the cable. So it pulled up these weights, which then went flying in all directions to the consternation of the observers watching the experiment. We don't know whether that's true or not, but it's nice to think it would be.
And there was a gun turret that was interesting as well, wasn't it, that was looked into?
Yes, there are some interesting plans that exist for a much more sophisticated gun turret than was ever flown on operations, which would have eventually abandoned because it would have needed its own engine in the fuselage itself to operate it. And I think it became too complicated, too heavy. But there are designs where the Manchester has a slightly enlarged fuselage in the middle to accommodate this turret and its associated engine. And again, there's a model in the museum of how
also, if you come to the museum, there's a display case on the rear wall by the Lancaster, and you can see some models showing some of these experimental aspects, can't you? And a little bit of text explaining them too.
There's another experimental. I think this speaks to the how advanced some of the design ideas were at the time in Avro. Because another thing that was reached the point of at least detailed plans, because we've got them in the archives. The Manchester was put forward as a potential aircraft to test in-flight refuelling, where the bomb bay would have a 1,000-pound fuel tank in it, and all kinds of hoses are delineated on those plans. Not quite sure exactly how it would have worked, but again, catapult-assisted launching, arrested landing, in-flight refuelling, all common nowadays. And we're talking here about the early 1940s when these were being looked at.
Thank you to Jim for giving us such a clear picture of the Manchester. As you know, we always like to bring you the human stories behind Avro aircraft, and that's exactly what Jim will be doing in the next episode. Do listen out for that. But in the meantime, it's goodbye from me, Chris Beswick. Bye-bye.